Security for having me once again here in this virtual event. And thanks, Kelly, and all the volunteers who are making up this event a great, grand success. So, without further delay, get into the um, let's get into the topic of discussion today for somebody who is interested in career within the Security Operations Center. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is around navigating the unknowns in the world of cyber SOC. Now, when we talk about cyber SOC, typically it's a very mission oriented team, and the objectives of the team typically lays around detecting the threat, what we call it as threat detection, incident response, and mitigating the threats. So these are the top three things that comes, or we call it top of the mind when we talk to any of the cyber SOC team. Now, the topic that I'm going to discuss today about is how in this world of cyber SOC, there are two perspectives that I wanted to bring it, and it's a very going to be high level, and it's a lot of food for thought for the people who already are working in SOC or somebody who wants to join up in the SOC team. Okay, so the two perspectives that I'm going to talk to today is about one is within the SOC how you could effectively do the threat detection. Second is how convergence of the SOC with the rest of the other teams, cybersecurity teams, which could be something rolled within the CISO, can benefit an effective threat detection. We will see in a while how do we do that through the scenario basis. So let's get started. So the agenda that I'm going to cover for somebody who's, because I do see today in DOS there are lots of new faces, there are lots of people who are looking at the career in the cybersecurity. So I will little bit touch upon what the SOC looks like, and then we will jump into a scenario based where we could effectively utilize some of the three-step processes, or I could say in other words, a best practices which effectively the SOC has to use it in a way that we can do an effective threat detection. So let's get started. Okay, so for somebody who is new in the SOC, feel free to chat. I could, answer it as it's a virtual world. In person is always different, but the virtual is very hard to kind of interact. But please feel free if you have any questions. I could answer it over here. So for somebody who is new into the SOC, let me just begin with giving you a high level understanding of what SOC means. Okay. So when you talk to anybody SOC, when you talk SOC basically stands for Security Operations Center. And as I said, the word itself looks very mission oriented, right? And what do we do as a mission? The top three objectives that I talked about is one is we do the threat detection. We do the incident response. When I say incident, meaning you might have heard of a lot of data breaches that happens, right? So when the data breaches of a company happen, that's an incident that the company undergoes, right? And when an incident happens, there is a team, a SOC team who has to analyze it, investigate it of how the attacker got in, what did the attacker do, and so on steps, right? Now, in course of doing this, what goes behind the scenes? Let me give you that glimpse, okay? So let's consider a scenario for today is with lots of adoption to the cloud. Let's assume that you're all tasked with a mission of threat detection for a cloud environment. Okay, so how would a typical SOC work behind the styles, right? It would first begin with understanding the environment. So the environment, the scenario that we're talking today here, for an instance, an example that I took over here was a cloud environment. So we would begin with understanding the cloud environment for that organization. Okay. Second is we will understand what are the assets being used for that organization in the cloud. Then we would think about what are the threats that is being, which are prevalent in the cloud environment. And the fourth, not the least, that the SOC works about, how do I detect the threat? Now, these four steps that I talked about might differ from an organization to organization. Remember, the industries are all different, right? There could be somebody who is working in telecom industry. There could be somebody who is working in an IoT industry, somebody in manufacturing, somebody in a product company, right? So based on the industry type is where these, these four steps that I talked might differ a little bit, but at a high level, this is how the SOC would begin when we think about a use case of detecting a threat in a cloud environment, giving you a scenario of a cloud for an instance. Now, what happens in this scenario, right? So now that we have begun with the scenario that talking about, we are all assumed, we are all missioned with the task of detecting the threat in the SOC, in the cloud. Now, you did your first four basic steps. But what happens, right? Next is typically the heart of the SOC is we work with logs. For somebody who's new, let me tell you, we work with logs. What I mean by logs over here is we collect the logs from various data sources that we call it, right? So we like, for example, if there is a Windows machine, we collect the logs from Windows machine, we collect the logs from endpoints, we collect the log from servers. If it's a cloud environment, right, wherever the resources are sitting, whether it's a container, whether it's a Kubernetes, you collect logs from every data sources, because the logic is something that SOC team writes is detecting the threats on the top of the logs, right? So you have the logs collecting, then you will write a logic on the top to detect the so and respective threats. It could be a ransomware threat that you will be writing a logic, or it could be something that you are determining a crypto mining activity that you will write a logic on the top. So you see, all these logics have been written, it's been written on the top of the logs that you would be spanning across. And what happens typically in this is, with today's world where there are lots and lots of security products, we kind of bring in all these logs into one central analytics. It could be either the Splunk, or it could be a curator where you will aggregate all the logs, and then we spun up a lot of analytic solutions behind the scene. But what happens to the team who is actually working in the SOC is, every organization, whether it's an in-house SOC or a managed SOC, the common challenges that each one of us faces the alert fatigue. The first, there are various challenges being faced, but today for the session, I have just narrowed down to two. One of the top two challenges that the SOC faces, alert fatigue. The first one is alert. What I mean by alert fatigue is there are too many alerts that the SOC, the analysts have to go through it. Let's assume for a minute the scenario that we talked about was a cloud environment threat detection. You might have written 10 use cases to detect a threat. Do you think the 10 use cases that you're detecting the threat would only give you a 10 alerts? Not so. There'll be so many ample of amount of alerts that each of your use cases will be popping upon, where the analyst, there's a time consuming process that the analysts have to do it in terms of, deciding that this particular event, is it really an incident for my organization, or is it something false positive? So this is one of the top challenges that SOC team faces. The second challenge that the SOC team faces is around the visibility of the environment in itself. What I mean by that is, what we think, if the cloud environment is the zone that you are all visioned today to look at the SOC, for building up or developing a threat detection, not always 100% sure that you are aware of all the assets within it. There is lots of visibility challenges. You never know what resources are up today, because cloud is ephemeral, right? So resources which are up today might be down tomorrow. So there's a lot of these top two challenges which is there. Now, because of these challenges, every SOC will have some process in place in terms of to deal with these challenges. And that's what I mean, that how do you do an effective detection, right? And how do I do by effective detection? While there can be various ways that every enterprise might have it, depending on the industry that they come in. But today I'm going to talk about two things, okay? And there's a 3-step process, which is some of the best practices that I would like to bring in with 17 years of my career in the SOC, and how, basically looking all the sides of the customers, right from mid-size to enterprise. And this is something that I thought I could bring it out to the team over here, for somebody who's already working in SOC, or somebody who's really looking at the career in the SOC, right? So let's jump into the 3-step process. So remember, the scenario is still the same. You're all tasked with detecting the threat in a cloud environment, and you're all working in the SOC team. So let's begin with the first step process. It's a 3-step process that you will have to go through it, okay? For a best, I'm talking about something that you're detecting has to be impactful for for the organization. So something that you're detecting has to drive decision factors. So it's not like all the threats that I'm detecting may be impactful to my organization. There should be something which is concerning for my organization, and I need to do that, okay? So the first thing would be, let's go with identification of risk zone. That's the best thing that you could do begin with. Second is, look at trending TTPs, and we will talk in detail about all of these. And the third and not last and not the least is convergence of people, process, and technology from other security operation teams, which works in co-injection with the SOC. Okay, so let's begin with the first step, which is called identification of the risk zones. Now, what typically I have seen in the SOC, whether it's an in-house SOC or a managed SOC, typically when you go and meet any of the SOC team people, when you're mission with when you're given them a mission of detecting a threat in a this, let's take the same scenario of detecting the threat in the cloud environment, right? It the the team would just jump upon stating that there are already pre-built list of queries or the pre-built list of use cases that is being there. That's how the first hop in happens. So what is that things have to be changed as the best practices is, if you want an effective threat detection, you will have to begin with identification of the risk zone. You have to bucketize your problem statement within your SOC with risk zones. Now, what I mean by risk zone, giving you an examples over here, which is a current risk in the last 3 years that we have seen, is something that even the Gartner has posted over here, right? So let's begin with expansion in the attack surface. Giving an example, today we are all virtual in the world, right? Today you might be working from your home and accessing your critical data of your organization. So you see the expansion of the attack surface is everywhere. People could, attackers could also kind of impersonate in a way that they could, whether it doesn't matter. There's no more on-prem world. It's all, you're all onto the cloud. The second risk zone that we are seeing in the last few years, or last, probably I could say between the COVID, with pre-COVID or post-COVID, what I can talk is attackers are, impersonating the user, which is the identity system in itself has become a risk. How do you know the user A, who is an authorized user, is really accessing the sensitive information A, or is it an impersonated user, or probably I should call it as an attacker who is accessing the insensitive information? So the identity system today is at risk, and vice versa. And you can add in as much as risk zone, which is available today. But remember, you have to identify the risk zone which is more relevant to your industry. The first best practices that I talk to the SOC team is, don't jump onto the use cases immediately saying that there can be a threat A, threat B, threat C, but begin with always with your risk zones. And this risk zone inputs could either come with you formulating it, or probably something, there is a compliance and risk team, you could get it some sort of a risk from your risk registry. What are the risk zones? The auditors, you could talk to the auditors and get your risks. Okay, so because there are the breakpoints that you could see, where are the gaps in my system, and I could bring that more and more visible monitoring solutions for that. Giving another risk zone, for example, if you're in a company or industry which is using a lot of third-party softwares, and that becomes a risk zone for you. It could be in a way that your industry is still using some of the legacy system, then that becomes a risk zone of you. Now, each of this risk zone that you're bucketizing, you will have to individually look at. Next is looking at the tactics, techniques, and procedures. Okay, so giving you a scenario that we were talking about is, we are all missioned with the threat detection of a cloud environment. We will begin with identification of a risk zone, and for the time that we are going to talk today, let's pick up one risk zone, which is identity system. Okay, now considering identity system is a risk zone, our SOC team will start formulating or developing a plan of what are the things that is considering for, what are the things that is looking as a threat in the identity system. Now, as I said, there are two perspectives. One is, let's look from the angle of SOC team in itself. Typically, the SOC team would work with utilizing a lot of frameworks. Giving you the simplest example, if you have heard of MITRE framework, they have beautifully given you a lot of tactics and techniques that are just updated till today of what the attackers are using. But the key question that you have to ask about here is, am I going to look at all of the tactics and techniques I'm going to implement in my organization for my SOC team? Or am I going to focus only on the key ones which is impactful? So I could say, Richmond, you have asked a question, so I'll come back to you in a little while around the risk zone. So let me just cover up, and I can address your question around the risk zone. So coming back, the TTPs, right? So you have to focus on the three things. Whenever, no matter which framework you're following, whether it's a MITRE framework or any other framework, when you look at any of the techniques that is being recently used by the attackers, focus on the three things. First is, if it's an identity system as a risk zone, think about what is the first key that the attacker would come in. What are the top trending techniques or tactics that the attackers are using for the identity system? Giving a simple example, and this is not a complete list over here for a deck meaning, but this is some of the examples that I want to join this today. If you look in the identity system world, the key that the attacker is using is compromised credential, which is already available in the dark web. They're utilizing extensively those and then trying to break into the system. This is one simple example. That's a key that attackers are breaking in. Attackers are also breaking in, manipulating your MFA, multi-factor. You might be a company which is having an multi-factor authentication enabled. There are still a lot of organizations who are not enable MFA or a zero trust architecture in itself, right? So attackers are manipulating the tokens and getting inside the network. Okay, so that's a key. The second is, once you derive for a particular risk zone the key, the next step that you have to think about is, okay, once the attackers have got this key, what are they doing inside the network? How are they laterally moving within the network? And that's why you will have to jot it down. Okay, so I'm giving you an identity system as a scenario that I took today as an example. And when we talk about identity system, the first thing that comes into everybody's mind is Active Directory, right? So the attackers are also behind the Active Directory because that's the golden jewel that you have all the users, all your employee details in it, your passwords, hashes. It has every single detail, right? So what the attacker, once they get the key, once they compromise the system, when they have to move laterally, what do? They tend to get all the wherever possible, they'll try to take the remote access of it. They may elevate their privileges, right? So this is what they do when they have to break one risk zone. So you will have to map this for every risk zone. Find the trending TTPs. Is this best practices that you have to do it? Because many a times what happens with various frameworks that is available, SOC team jumps upon every framework, but not remember, you would be wasting enough of time if you're going to implement all of the techniques. Remember, if you have to make an impactful decision, impactful, effective, and actionable threat detection, you have to focus only on narrow down your focus only to the key ones. Okay. Having this within the SOC team, focusing on the trending TTPs, what do you do next, right? So the key, now that you know the key that the attackers are using in the identity system, know how the attackers are traversing through the network. What are they behind? You have to also know what are they behind. Are they behind something, the password? If it's an Active Directory, probably they are behind the password to get the password hash dump in itself. Or are they behind the backup of system? Because ransomware, you don't remember, if there is no backup of a system, your entire data is in the hands of somebody else. So what are they behind? So put a list, develop this plan, trending tactics, and then make a meaningful logic at the top. Okay. So this is from the perspective of the SOC. The next perspective that I would like to bring about here is, this is something which I haven't yet seen a lot of organization getting in an implemented stage, but I would like to call it out and its most effective direction. Now that within the SOC, when people are working hard enough to make the threat use cases, with the earlier slide that I was talking about the TTPs, the other aspect, when it comes, whether you're a SOC director or a manager or a CISO, think about developing a strategies which will benefit a SOC team with the convergence of the rest of the business teams that are there. Now, what I mean, give me a scenario of it. The teams that I've taken today as an examples is the compliance team, vulnerability team, red team, inputting. Okay, so let's give an example. The scenario that we were talking about here is detecting a threat in a cloud environment. As a step one, the first step that you did is you identified the risk zones, and the risk zone that we were talking today as an example was an identity system. Okay. The second thing what I did within the SOC was I was trying to develop a plan of what is a key that the attacker is getting inside, right? And giving you an example, let's assume for a minute that compromised credential is one of the biggest risks that the attackers are getting inside the network. So what can I do about it? How the other teams can help the SOC team. Okay. Many a times SOC team, then it becomes a very, kind of a siloed. I don't want that team to be always focusing on a siloed, because there's a lot of time involved in terms of analysis and deep investigations. Remember, you also have a compliance team. Giving you an example, that could be depending on your organization from where you come. You will have to do that study of what are the teams that I have within my cyber operation, which are under my umbrella of CISOs or probably, right? So where I can get more inputs from other team. Giving an example of a compliance team. While you're working on a case where the compromised credential is one of the risks that the attackers are using today, remember there's a compliance team as well who is measuring at the enterprise level or at the organization level, who knows that what is the state of the compliance of that particular risk. What is compliance? Compliance is nothing but there are a lot of frameworks that you would be implementing, whether it's an ISO framework, or it could be any of the, the various US frameworks that you be, and depends again country to country what frameworks are you implementing. So those are controls. They are nothing but controls, security controls that has to get implemented at the base minimum level. So when your minimal controls are going to fail, what happens? More and more threats are going to come inside your network, right? Now let's assume for a minute that we were talking about the use case about the identity system, and knowing that the attackers are coming into your network through a compromised credential. The first question, while you would be developing your use cases logics about the threat detection, think on the other aspect. The question that you have to ask is, what is the compliance state of my enterprise in terms of implementing the solutions of MFA? Or do I have a lot of unused accounts? Because remember, unused accounts can also be a open door for attacker to come in. So how a SOC team will know what is a compliance? If the compliance posture of a company itself is poor, then how are you going to, every direction that you're going to do is SOC is going to be too much of load, right? So the question that the SOC team have to work with the rest of the teams is to know the compliance state, and this is where I would call as an enrichments, which has to come from the various other teams and implement within your SOC, whether it's an automated way, or whether it's a process oriented way, or whether it's a technology way. You will have to bring in that enrichments, and this is something that CISOs have to develop strategies, or probably somebody who is at the executive level bring in that enrichment resources. Because when you bring in that, when a SOC analyst or a SOC, somebody who is working the SOC, understand the compliance state of my company in itself is failing at this control, which means I can make it more monitoring. I could, strengthen my monitoring in terms of these areas, right? This is a simplest example that I would like to give, because many times it all becomes a silos that the compliance would always be working at adhering to the frameworks. SOC team is working at busy at working at threat detection. Combine the efforts in a way, bring in the tools and knowledges that the compliance team would be using, and bring in this within as an enrichment within the SOC. Okay, so I think, Richmond, you have an example. So would SOC identify the potential and current parts of the attack by attackers and plan of action against it? Then the compliance team would focus on the specific implement. Yes, you're absolutely right, Richmond. So this is a handshake. I would say this is a win-win situation for both the teams. Remember, when you bring in the enrichments from your compliance team, knowing, giving a simplest example, if your MFA, or if there are a lot of unused accounts in an enterprise, then the compliance team could, work in terms of getting those controls fixed quickly. Or vice versa, if the SOC team discovers that there are a lot of threats, when they perform a root cause analysis and they derive saying that there are too many excessive permissions given for a particular admin role which is not supposed to be given, they can go back to the compliance team and say that, hey, compliance team, look, I am looking at a lot of trends that is coming in the threat because of these excessive privileges being given. Why not you implement this as a control and put it and push it to the people to kind of business units to kind of get adhere to the compliance. So you see, it's a vice versa, and it's not always a one direction that you have to compliance team will pouring on the input. So this is a win-win situation for various teams. Similarly, figure it out what rest of the teams are there within your organization. Giving another example would be, sometimes within the vulnerability as a process is carried out within the SOC team, sometimes it's a separate team. Sometimes SOC teams are usually a defender team. It's called as a blue team. Sometimes a red team is a different. What's the job of a red team? Red team is it's an offending team. They try to break into the system. And when they break into the system, which means there's a gap, blue team has to sit and talk to the red team, get the inputs from there, implement a monitoring plan back to the blue team in a way that you can strengthen your and make your detections more actionable. So this is the key thing that I would like to bring in. If this is something that you're not implementing with your organization as a strategy, then I would urge that executives to bring in these strategy, because we don't want to because there's so many security products of late that I've seen in the evolution of a SOC team is getting bogged up with so much tools and the screens that they have looked into it. Why do you repeat the process, right? Why utilize the things which is already existing into your network, because this is also cost effective, right? When you get the inputs from the various team. So make a list. Compliance team is a simple example that I gave. There could be various teams which is within, again, industry to industry. It depends, organization to organization differs. Bring in those outcomes of the team, mergers and enrichments within your existing SOC team. And what are we doing with this? Because I talked about this is a process and technology convergence. But what is a people convergence doing here? Remember, because we are talking a lot about the cybersecurity skill set, and we also know there's a lots of article telling that demand of the skill set is very high. The skills, we're not getting effective people who are skilled at this level to kind of hire it. But imagine by doing this, you're also rotating the skill set. The compliance team would understand if there are people within the compliance team who want to work in the SOC, they get to know the operation of the SOC. So you're kind of creating opportunities for the people around the table and making them, and building the people, basically technical skill set, and it could be vice versa. Because often at time, what happens when we kind of hire people, we have seen there is a lot of skill set gap. We are trying to hire somebody who is at the, who can do the forensics. We are trying to hire somebody who can do at the stage 5 level of, kind of investigations. But how are we going to get them? How are you going to really mentor these people? It has to build from the fundamental of, let's rotate the people within the organization, make them part of the process, and that's how you kind of, build the skill set. So having said this, this was something that I wanted to bring in, because this was a high level thoughts and food for thought for all of you to think around how can I converge this process. It could be even a product team. I've been seeing in this chart of a day, there are a lot of product teams. Think about, because you are a product team, lot of if we are a product security company, we have been using, there could be gaps in the product vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities, remember, if it's a vulnerability says if in case it's a separate team, what are the SEV5 vulnerabilities. Feed that, remember, because if it's a vulnerability team, you will have your own patching cycle. What if the SOC team detects a threat because of one vulnerability, but the patching cycle is still ongoing? It becomes a feedback mechanism, feedback loop, saying that, we have detected a particular threat, and this threat is using a SEV5 vulnerability. Hey, product team, please go and fix it, because, attackers are breaking through this. And if it's still not on their list, they can add to the list. Okay, so this is something that, I would like to bring today in the conversation. But having said that, this is a high level view, and I would like to open up if there's more questions. So I hope I answered to you, Richmond, because there's one more question that you asked about. So would this risk zones you're describing be summarized as an attacks on your organization? Yes, sometimes you need to talk to a lot of people to understand the risk zones. And this is where, if you have a CISOs, there are multiple teams who are working within CISOs. You will have to, talk to the various auditors, compliance, look at where are the gaps, look at the talk to each one of the people, because you have to do that study. Because when we have to do that study, only results in effective threat detection. Otherwise, what happens typically in every SOC is people just jump in. There is a pre-built list. If there is a new thing that they have to build up as a threat detection plan, they just copy down that pre-built list, and that's where the effective threat detection goes down. So there has to be a little minor change that we will have to bring in with the trends that is going in the attack world, which is very sophisticated right now, right? So that's the key thing that I would like to bring about. Any questions? And open to the floor. I know I'm 2 minutes left, but I'm open to asking any further questions. If not, then thanks, Day of Security, once again. Love to be here again and again. Hopefully next year I would make it more I would jump in a deep dive session. So this time it was just a 25 minutes for us to kind of discover high level thoughts. Thank you, Day of Security. Thanks, Jean.